everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Melinda Robinson. I am the Director of Sponsored Programs at USD, and I will be the moderator for this discussion today. This discussion is titled Strategies for Resubmitting Grant Proposals. And a few housekeeping notes. We are, as Dan was just talking about, using a new platform. This is a Zoom webinar. So if you have a question, we'd like you to use the Q&A feature. You can ask your question anytime during the discussion, and we will have one of the panelists answer that live for you. But if for some reason we have too many questions at the end of uh, this webinar today, we'll have a FAQ we'll put together and send that out to everyone. So with all that, let's welcome our panelists. We have Dr. Daniel Engelbretson. He's the Vice President of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs at USD. Dr. Bridget Diamond Welch is the Director of Research and Innovation for the School of Health Sciences. And Dr. Jose Petrie is the Assistant Professor for Basic Biomedical Sciences. So thanks to all of our panelists for being here today. Dr. Engelbretson, we'll start with you. Can you talk about the importance of resubmitting proposals and why we thought this discussion was important to have today?
Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction, Melinda, and thank you all for taking the time to join us today. But really, kind of looking at the proposals that get submitted through the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, kind of surprised when I was kind of looking at things and saw lots of proposals that were submitted once and weren't selected for funding, and then nothing happened with that proposal again. And recognize that there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into preparing that proposal the first time. Want to make sure that folks are aware that you can resubmit that proposal either to the same agency, or you can even submit it to different agencies to increase your chances and likelihood of getting it funded. And so that's kind of what's the driver here today, is to try to capitalize as much as possible on the work that goes into preparing a proposal. Submit it as often as you can to as many places as you can until you get that funded. If it was a good idea, it's a good idea. Let's get some money behind it. So.
All right, great. Dr. Diamond Welch, could you give us a little bit about your background and then why you think resubmissions are important?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Bridget. I am the Director of Research and Innovation in the School of Health Sciences. And my background is a long and weird one, but was in criminal justice and in the med school for a while. And I've written grants for a wide variety of funders, both research grants and more application type grants. And many of those grants that I ended up receiving, particularly research grants, took took two or three tries before they were funded. I think a lot of you are familiar with revise and resubmit on articles. Grants should be considered them the same way. You send them out, you do the best job you can, and then frequently, depending on the funder, you might get that first R&R. So that rejection, you should really think of it as an R&R and write and resubmit. Is that everything I was supposed to cover?
Yes, thank you. Dr. Petrie, same question. Why is it important? And just give us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a basic biomedical scientist. So I do laboratory basic science research, and I've been funding my own research through federal and private external grants since back when I was a PhD student, pretty continuously until now. And the reason I think resubmissions are important is because with the funding climate the way that it is today, you have a very low chance of getting funded at any one given submission, right? Most agencies are hovering somewhere from like 7 to 20% of proposals are funded. So statistically speaking, even if you put in a really great proposal, it's unlikely to get funded the first time. And so for me, I have been continuously funded for like the last 10, 12 years, and I've never once had a proposal funded as a first submission. So resubmissions are kind of like the core of all of my continuous funding.
Okay, thank you. So anyone want to jump in? Can you give us an example of a proposal that you resubmitted and was funded? Kind of take us a little bit through the process. of the rejection and then what you did in between.
I can hop in and grab. I'm going to guess we all have similar stories. I will take the case of proposals that were submitted, rejected, and then resubmitted to the same agency. Usually with NIH, kind of using it as an example, and Jose can obviously chime in here as well. But NIH, they will let you know who's on the review section. The panel is going to be reviewing your proposal, and they usually the individual panelists will probably serve on through three review cycles. Kind of the goal is to have about a third of new panelists on each review panel be new, and so you've got a pretty good chance that the reviewers, if you resubmit quickly enough by the next cycle or even the cycle after that, there's a pretty good chance that there'll be some of the same reviewers that are on your proposal. So by addressing their comments, that really gives you a good opportunity to really, you know what they saw, what they perceive as being wrong with your proposal. You can very specifically address what they saw as being wrong, and hopefully convince them that you made it right. So I found that with NIH grant proposals, when I've been rejected, and much like the only story that I have of a proposal that was funded on the first submission is one that the grant specialists don't like me to tell because it violates just about everything that they like you to do. But almost all of my other proposals were funded on the resubmission, because then you've gotten a lot of feedback from the reviewers. And like I said, with NIH, if you can get that turned around within a submission cycle or two, you'll likely have some of the same reviewers on that panel. And oftentimes the program officer will intentionally, when they are sending the proposal back out for review, try to, if the same reviewers are there, have them review that proposal again. So that really gives you a good advantage. Now, you can also, if you saw some moronic responses, not that any reviewers ever give moronic responses to your proposal, you might want to try to kick that can down the road another cycle or two to try to get those reviewers off the panel. You never know who's actually going to be doing your review, but you can just kind of play the odds a little bit.
Yeah, and if I can jump in here, Dan, because it's actually, I have a pretty relevant experience to what you were just saying. And I think this idea of, sometimes you can take advantage of having the same reviewers again for a resubmission if you time it correctly. But you can also take advantage of having different reviewers for a resubmission if you, again, time it appropriately. And I found that kind of depends on the types of problems that are brought up in that proposal. And so, for example, if you have, I think of the problems that come up with the proposal as either sort of technical or scientific, like, a reviewer might not like certain controls that you have or certain types of experiments that you have, but they like the overall, goal, the overall problem that's being addressed. And conversely, you can have comments where maybe they don't have technical problems with the experiments, but maybe they just don't like the idea or think it's a particularly important problem. And so in that situation, it's actually better to try to time it so that you don't get the same reviewers. And one of my NIH grants that was funded a couple of years back, an R41, it actually, the first submission was not discussed. And so that means it was the bottom 50 percentile at best. Not a lot of technical issues brought up, but basically the reviewers didn't think that the problem was that important. And of course, I thought it was. I waited a year to turn it around. So by the time I resubmitted it, the whole panel was pretty much different. And I only put about 2 to 3 hours of actual work into that resubmission. There was no big scoping change, no new data, no new experiments, nothing, just a slight reframing of the question. And then it was funded with a very, very good score. And so sometimes it's just a matter of that strategy of trying to time reviewers correctly and getting lucky like that. So yeah.
And I think it's interesting. I think one thing that's showing is that different different agencies are going to have different policies and rules around resubmission. NIH has some really specific ones about timing and when you're allowed to and how often you're allowed to. Most of my funding actually comes from the Department of Justice, and those are completely different than NIH or NSF, although I've applied for funding from those agencies as well. But when my resubmission process for the DOJ, you have to wait a year. They come out once a year. That's it. So you wait that year and you either reapply or you don't reapply. So timing's not of an issue in there. So it's also knowing your funding agency and looking into what their rules and regulations are around that.
Well, and that's important, Bridget, as well. One example, this is quite a few years ago, but a company that I worked with, we developed technologies to use for environmental monitoring so we could understand how contamination plumes were migrating underground. Was the nature of the research that we did. And the EPA is obviously very interested in those sorts of technologies. And so I had written a proposal to the EPA, spent a lot of time. It was a really nice proposal. It didn't get funded. And EPA similarly had that year-long, you can't go in front of there. So I looked around and found, well, the Department of Energy also has similar interests. So I tweaked things a little bit, changed the format to fit. But again, that's a few hours of work that goes into those sorts of things, as opposed to coming up with a new idea and generating new data and stuff, and submitted it to the Department of Energy. And well, they turned it down as well. And then National Institutes of Health had come out with a solution. Actually, this would be because this proposal, I submitted it to NIEHS, the National Institutes of Environmental Health and Safety, and they funded it on the initial submission to them. But I don't count that as it was the initial submission to them, but it was my third submission of the idea, and they funded it. And I was at a conference discussing the technology and how it's really helpful to use this to identify these. And the program officer from the EPA came up and said, well, why did you come to us with that idea? And I said, I did. and you thought it was a really bad idea, didn't you? But again, just kind of taking that work that went into it the first time. That was a lot of work, a tremendous amount of work that went into it. Each of the resubmissions was quite a bit less. And I was also, from each of the reviews that I'd gotten from EPA and DOE, I was integrating what they had seen, the weaknesses or the strengths that they had, and highlighting them or downplay, whatever it was from a strategy perspective. You always want to be learning from those things. But they were just bouncing from agency to agency because each one of these agencies was on a 1-year cycle. And I didn't want to wait to go in again. So.
Okay, thank you. So along that same line, submitting to the same agency is a different process. But when you're looking to submit to a different funder, as you were talking about, Dan, how do you find those similar opportunities that goes with the proposal that you're currently submitted and it wasn't funded?
Yeah, well, a big part of that is just being aware of the funding opportunities that are out there. NIH each week sends out their guide, which has what are the new opportunities that were released by the National Institutes of Health that week. Each website has updates. There's a couple of different groups that we subscribe to, or that we can subscribe to, that just gives us these weekly updates. The state EPSCoR office sends out weekly updates of new funding opportunities. So there's lots of places to be aware, or to find about the opportunities that are there and available to be applied for. It is important to note that when you have to be careful if you have the same proposal out for review at the same time to multiple agencies. Taking NSF as an example, they allow that to have it out for review at multiple agencies, but they ask that you disclose that, and then on your current pending support, you describe either why it's the same. You can say, hey, I'm shopping an idea, or you can describe, probably better to describe why what you're proposing to NSF is different than what you propose to NIH, taking them as an example. We're going to be addressing this fundamental basic science question here, whereas the similar proposal to NIH is looking at a application of that technology or something. So you want to be cautious when you're going to have the same proposal out for review with multiple agencies to make sure you're complying with all the rules that they have.
And I just want to say, I was already writing and getting grants before I learned that you could do that you can have the same proposal out and multiple agencies at the same time. It's not unethical. You just need to disclose it, like Dan said. And then if you get funded by both, then they have a conversation and decide who's going to fund you, basically. So you can do that.
Do you recommend doing that? Like if you're submitting a proposal, should you also be looking at multiple agencies, or do you normally wait to see if the one you initially submitted to is funded before looking for other opportunities?
I was always usually thinking of what other areas might be interested in this, because again, it's a lot of work to prepare a high quality proposal. You have to try, what you can't do is prepare a one size fits all proposal. Every agency has different missions. So it's not like you can literally take the exact same thing you wrote and just change the address on the mailing label, though nobody mails anything anymore. But the equivalent low work of changing the address on the mailing label and send it to a different agency. You still have to make sure it's tuned to fit their needs and things. But I usually, because Jose had pointed out, in this current funding climate, you're doing really well if you hit 1 in 6, 1 or 7 applications. And while yes, I have lots of good ideas, it takes a lot of time to prepare these things. It's much easier to tweak a proposal to go someplace different than to come up with a whole brand new idea and new set of data to go along with it. So particularly for junior faculty, they're getting their careers going and stuff, kind of thinking about how many different places can I submit this isn't a bad thing to be doing.
So to piggyback on that, kind of what I do in terms of waiting to resubmit versus not is, I would say over, a period of like 5 years or so, I'll have like 3 to 4 core ideas that I really work on. And so there's really 3 to 4 grants that are different, but that might be 10 to 15 to 20 submissions, depending on what gets funded or not. So once I have these kind of like 3 or 4 core grants, most of the technical aspects and most of the science really doesn't change much, except in response to minor reviewer comments and things like that. But what really changes is sort of the formatting to fit the different agencies, and then sort of the messaging, the framing of the problem to fit the priorities and the missions of these different agencies, because almost all federal agencies have research grant programs. And I think people don't always appreciate that there's a staggering amount of overlap between these types of missions, whether it's NIH and NSF and DoD. The same scientific project could be funded by any of the 3, depending on how you frame that. So there's a lot of misconceptions around that too. Like I hear people talk about NSF doesn't fund disease research, and they don't fund clinical research, but they will fund disease-related research if you give it a basic science spin. So there's a lot of, for example, cancer research that gets funded by NSF, and the science behind it is the same. It's just repackaged as a more of a basic science grant. And so that's kind of my strategy, is I just take these core ideas and then I sort of dress them up in different ways to stagger submissions to different agencies.
Well, and that NSF and NIH pairing is always an interesting one, because again, NSF obviously leans more towards the basic science sides of things, but you've got such different scales, financial scales of NSF grants versus NIH grants. NSF is not going to pay any academic year salary. The 2 months summer salary is kind of the max that they'll give, some postdoc stuff. So it's a very different scale from, say, an NIH R01. But I could see very much having the same general idea going to both NSF and NIH, where NSF, you're looking at a very basic, a basic biology mechanism question, whereas at NIH, you're looking at more the application of that technology to something, to a disease state or something like that. You'd want to disclose those things, but have both of those out and under review. Again, so as long as you've talked to the program officers and have a clear distinction of the difference between the two of them, that'd be a really sound strategy to have, actually, because just again, you can't do with the 100K a year from NSF that you can with 350K a year from NIH. There's radically different scales.
Do you feel like the program officers are a big help? I mean, regardless if it's NSF, NIH, when you have an idea, is that something you do first? Do you reach out to them and I got this idea, would this be a great fit for this, particular thing, aid or directive, or NSF is directive, but that you're trying to apply to? And also in regards to resubmitting, do you feel like they're a big help in helping guide you in that process?
So I can start. I would say it varies depending on the program. So different programs have different program officers, and I have found wildly varying degrees of helpfulness, both with initial ideas and with resubmissions. So, for example, I have had our latest R01 that's incoming. When I originally spoke to the program officer about the original idea before doing the first submission, the program officer actually told me that she didn't think anybody would be interested in the project, even though it ended up with a fundable score. So, if I would have listened to her, I would have not bothered to submit it. But at the same time, if you have program officers that sometimes they attend the review panels, then they can give you very specific feedback about little things that the reviewers were discussing and kind of the context of the problems that they were discussing that don't necessarily show up on paper when you get your paper reviews back. And so I have found that those program officers that do that can be very helpful for resubmission. And it's important to kind of touch base with them ahead of time, because then you can kind of nudge them, build a relationship with them, and sort of encourage them to go to the discussion panels, and then they can give you that feedback, because they're not required to do so, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
And I would agree with everything that Jose said. I've usually found, particularly as I'm preparing a proposal, the feedback I've gotten from program officers is usually kind of meh. I've been told, and I think this is true, that they basically can't tell you no. So they never say, "Oh yeah, that's a really bad idea. Don't bother submitting it." They can't tell you that. But I've had really good success working with them on the resubmission side. That's where I will usually invest my effort. But then you've got a lot more specific questions you can ask. And I'm trying to think back. Most of the program officers that I've dealt with on resubmission had been in the room when the proposals were initially discussed, and so they can kind of give you that feel for the room that the reviewers had as they were discussing your proposal. And that's really valuable to know whether or not you want to try to hurry this thing around to get it resubmitted to have that same review group, because yeah, they liked it, but didn't fund it, or was it just a group that really didn't like what you're doing? You're better off waiting for a year to try to get that group of reviewers just out of the house.
Okay, thank you. So, do most program officers, or most proposals that you submit that may not be funded, do you receive feedback on majority of those, or is there times when there's no feedback? And if there isn't, how do you go about getting that feedback?
So again, I think that's going to depend on your funding agency. I'd be interested from Jose and Dan if they've ever not gotten feedback from NSF or NIH. I've always gotten feedback there. We don't always get feedback from the Department of Justice or Department of Labor or HRSA. Well, we get feedback from HRSA, but the feedback's not always helpful. So for example, we just did not receive a grant. We submitted, got the feedback, got our score. The score was in the high 80s. The feedback was all, this is excellent. There was no negative feedback. So then I'm like, well, why is it that score, right? So, and then some agencies just never send feedback. You try to get feedback, they won't. It's just really gonna depend on the agency that you're working with. I think, so I'd be interested to hear about NSF and NIH. I've had less interaction with them. I have always received feedback from them, but for you two, have you ever not received feedback?
No, I believe both NSF and NIH are required to get, but by the rules of their programs, you always get the review comments and things. At least in the case that I've had.
Yes. So like with HRSA, we are following up to say, can we meet? So that's where I was going to go with that. We're going to say, can we meet? So then we can get specific feedback for why this is all excellent, yet we didn't get funded and had a high 80 instead of a much higher score. Like what happened there? So that when it does come around next year, we're in a position to use that to reapply. I'm sorry, Jose, I didn't mean to talk over.
No problem. Yeah, so like Dan said, I mean, NSF and NIH, they're required to give you sort of this template written feedback and critiques. But what varies is additional feedback beyond that. So if you just get your paper review and then you talk to your program officer and they say, oh, well, I wasn't at the review meeting, so I'm on the same page as you with how to interpret those reviews. That's a different scenario than if you have a program officer who says, yeah, I went to the discussion, and so even though it says this on the paper, that was really just one reviewer who was really adamant about this one little detail, and it wasn't really a big important part of the conversation, so you don't need to focus on that in your resubmission. Those kind of things can be very helpful, but that requires having a more sort of personal relationship with your program officer to get that kind of help. So that's why I always encourage people to just spend the time to get to know the POs that they're working with, so that they can sort of get this next level feedback about their feedback.
Great. So when you're thinking about having your proposal not funded or rejected, is there common fixable problems that usually happen, or is it generally the science they just hate, or is it more administrative stuff, or they think, you're not asking for enough money, you're asking for too much money? What is usually the issue commonly, I guess?
I was at most, for me, particularly earlier in my career, I just wasn't a good grant writer. I knew what I wanted to say. I knew the problem. I thought I was articulating it well and how I was going to solve it well. And frankly, wasn't. I was assuming that the reviewers knew more about the problem than I did. And so, and I still see that when I get my reviewer comments back. It's like, oh yeah, I assumed that they knew that, and they didn't, and that was bad on me. And so I would spend too much time describing the wonderful data and things. Well, the data should speak for itself. Just should be framing the problem and do a better job articulating my solution to the problem. So I've seen, for me at least, it's been more on the grantsmanship side and the assumptions that I make about what people know about the problem rather than the technical side of things. And I was kind of, Jose had alluded to this earlier, using NIH as an example. They pretty much, they'll only score the proposals that are not only in the top half of the deck. And so if you didn't get a scored proposal, that might be more reflective of there being some real technical challenges in it. But usually if you've gotten scored and gotten some reviewer comment, a lot of the technical stuff is there. You just maybe haven't presented it well or clearly enough.
But I found that it can be the opposite too. I mean, it really depends on kind of what you're working on and things like that. I work on a lot of controversial things, and so I run into this situation a lot where people just don't like the hypothesis because it's controversial, and those get not discussed, but they're sort of easier to address because it's more about finding somebody that's open-minded. And so I always sort my issues with non-funded proposals as either kind of technical things versus this type of problem that I imagine arises for some other people in different fields as well, of just your ideas in a broad sense not being necessarily amenable to other people in the field. And the strategies for dealing with those two types of things are obviously quite different.
And from another perspective, from a more qualitative, a lot of my research grants use qualitative methods, particularly with the populations I work with, highly vulnerable populations. There's a lot more concern than you have space for addressing how all your human subjects protections and the considerations that you're going to take in place. And you only have so much. I work a lot with Indigenous populations, so there's only so much space in your grant to illustrate that you understand what the processes of working with these populations and working with tribes and getting those approvals. So I get a lot of questions back on the human subjects elements that I can easily address when I get the, do the 1-page response of like, this is how we're going to do that, that actually can alleviate some of the space concerns, and I can address some of those issues. So I think for me, because unlike Dan, I am an excellent grant writer. Just kidding. Get that out to Dan. I think for me, a lot of it comes down to those human subjects types of concerns that they're having.
What advice would you give to someone who has 3 or 4 proposals that they just kind of threw in a pile due to frustration? And now that we're having a discussion, it's like, maybe I could resubmit. What would be a next step for someone that just kind of thought it was all was lost, but now maybe they could resubmit? What would be a next step for them?
Yeah, I would say reach out to, if it was recently enough so that the program officer is still there, reach out and see what they can share, because that does, I think, give some pretty good feedback on the resubmission side. If it's gotten a little bit further down the road, I think you want to do an honest assessment of, make sure that the scientific question is still valid. The science changes rapidly. and if it's been no longer relevant, it might just be a missed opportunity. But if it's still relevant, grab a colleague, have them look through the proposal, see whatever review or comments you have, and get it resubmitted, because there's a lot of work that went into it, and try to capitalize on that work as much as you can. And get in touch with our office. We can help find maybe a new place to shop it, something, but take advantage of the work that you put in.
That was going to be one of my comments, was just look around for other agencies, whether they're federal agencies. There are a lot of private foundations that give away quite a lot of money for research projects. And so for me personally, I use NIH actually has a database of non-NIH funding opportunities for health related research, and it has like hundreds of different programs and agencies and foundations, et cetera, that offer various types of research grants. And so when I get a little bit frustrated, I tend to just kind of go hunting in there and think about how I can fit some of the stuff that I've been doing into the mission of a new potential funder, and start reworking a proposal for somebody else, basically.
What about collaborators? Say if you have a proposal that didn't get funded, have you ever added a collaborator to make it stronger? What advice could you give on that?
So Bridget, you're nodding quite a bit there. So you want to take that one?
I have. I think when you're writing grants, the agency is looking at a couple of things. They're looking at, is your idea good? Do you know how you're answering your question? And then are you the right person to be answering this question? And sometimes they might not think that you're the right person to be answering that question. And so, and maybe you're not completely for whatever reason. I am a big fan of finding the right collaborators to begin with. And so thinking through, what is this project going to take? Well, I have a project that is going to require developmental evaluation. Do I know developmental evaluation? No, I've never done it before. So I found someone who does to bring them on board to begin with. And I've had rejection from grants where they didn't think that we had a complete team. And so finding who is that missing component and bringing them in. I have cold emailed people from across the country to say, I'm working on this project. Are you interested? And build collaborations that way. I find it, even if you go, like there's some big names in my field, the people I want to be when I grow up, that I will email and say, hey, I'm working on this proposal. We met this one time through this thing. Would you be interested, or would you have someone? And usually they're not, because they have 5 billion things on their plates, and that's how they got to be that big name that I want to be when I grow up. But they have a student that's trained under them that is doing this work that maybe I didn't think of, and then they connect us, and we're able to work together to develop a project. I don't know if I'm fully answering the question, but collaborations are wonderful and horrible, and I could go on forever about collaborations, but really thinking through what your project is and what the skill sets are and how your CV illustrates whether or not you have those skill sets. And even if you have that skill set, but it's not on your CV, thinking about who you can bring in and then what elements or place can you bring them in on in order to shore up your application, I think is a very smart approach to research. And we could also talk about community collaborations or other partnerships that you have for research, depending on the type of research you have, about what type of letters of support that you get to ensure that you can do your research, and thinking through that. Now I'm just talking a long time because we could just do an hour on collaboration, but that is my answer. I will stop.
Well, and that collaborative science is just the way things are going. The big phrase at National Science Foundation now is convergence research, where you're basically more than just ripping down the barriers between the disciplines. You're bringing in the humanities and the social sciences and all of that stuff coming together. NSF is clearly heading down that direction. NIH has they introduced the multiple investigator mechanism. This is now quite a few years ago, basically recognizing that a lot of the key questions can't really be asked by, or can't be answered by an individual any longer. And so you need to have multiple investigators. So that's clearly the way that science is going, is into tearing down the walls between the various disciplines. So I'm not going to be surprised if in 10, 12 years, the norm isn't going to be that your proposals have multiple investigators on them, whereas now that's still kind of the exception. So it's probably good to start building those collaborative networks now, because that's the way it's going.
Okay, great. Well, we are winding down here. So I would like for each of you to give kind of some final tips or advice on resubmitting grant proposals, or talk about anything that we didn't cover. If you each want to go a couple minutes. Dr. Ingebretson, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I'd just say just do it. It can be frustrating. Actually, well, not can be. It is frustrating when you've poured a ton of work, a lot of sweat, a lot of late nights, a lot of frustration to getting a proposal put together. And particularly the first time you read, when you don't get funded, you read through the reviewer comments, you're quite certain that all of the reviewers are morons. Once you get past that stage, you realize that no, they're probably not. They're probably good people that are trying to do good things. But every proposal, I've always gone with the mindset of when I submit it, I'm going to keep on submitting it either to the same agency or to different agencies until it gets funded. It was a good idea. Well, to have good ideas, you have to have bad ideas. So there probably are some bad ideas out there, yeah, usually by the time I've decided to put the effort into preparing a proposal, I've talked to enough of my colleagues and things that's probably one of those good ideas that I have, and it deserves to be developed. And so I think I start with the mindset of I'm gonna work on this thing until it gets funded.
Great. Dr. Diamond Welch.
So I agree with Dan. I feel angry usually after I get rejected, and it lasts proportionate to how much time I spent on the grant. And so I allow myself that anger and don't reply to emails about it or work on it while I'm feeling that anger, unless I'm talking to a collaborator and we're both talking about what a moron reviewer number 2 is, right? Like that's, and you've all submitted articles, so you know those feelings. And they happen, I think, extend even harder when there's a grant, because grants are a huge undertaking. So I allow myself to feel those feelings, but then I go back in once I'm over them and think about, okay, what are they right on? How can I make this better? What can I learn from this? How can I improve for next time, even if for some reason I'm not going forward with this? And there are reasons you might not want to go forward with a grant, particularly if you have community partners that are no longer partnering, or there are reasons. But every rejection is a learning opportunity, so take that. And then if you can reapply, making sure that you have the passion to continue and continuing that work. This is also where collaborators are great, because you can shore each other up and get through the rewrite and the resubmit. So yeah, feel those feelings, but then commit. You spend all that time on it. Don't waste that time. Go back in and either find a new agency or reapply to the same agency when their cycle allows you to. And as many times as they'll let you, honestly, you should. So I don't have any other advice besides that.
Oh, thank you. I was on mute. Dr. Petrie.
Yeah, so other than just submit more, which has already been said by the 2 other panelists, but I really do look at it like a slot machine in a sense. You just have to keep doing it until you get the right combination of everything to get funding. But one thing I would encourage people to really do is to get really creative with thinking about what types of problems the research that they're doing could really be relevant to or solve. Because most of the time, even though we all tend to think of our research as being particularly focused on, solving this disease or this social issue, that often comes with many implications for other types of things. And that's where I've had the most success, is just taking something that I thought was one thing. Like, I'm writing a grant about insect physiology, and maybe it doesn't get funded as an insect physiology grant, but maybe it's useful for pest control, or maybe that insect can be used as a model for some similar process that happens in a human health condition. And so even though we might not intuitively think about all the tens of different ways that our own specific research could have implications that are benefit to other federal agencies, almost everybody's doing research that has relevance across a lot of different areas. And sometimes it's just as simple as taking a scientific proposal that's already solid and keeping the same science and convincing somebody else that doing that same exact science would help solve a different problem, and you get funding somewhere else. And I think that's something that people just don't do enough, and you have nothing to lose from doing that type of repackaging and seeing how different field, different type of area might feel about your work.
All right, thank you. So Q&A, do we have any questions from the attendees? If you have a question, you can type it in the Q&A feature.
Everyone did a great job today. I feel like we covered a lot of ground and there was a lot of good advice given.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing any questions, but I do have a thank you for a great discussion.
All right.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Well, all right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.